Good evening, everybody, at Hampstead Garden Suburb Synagogue. This is an exciting event we have for you this evening, and a really important, vital conversation to be had. Tonight, we are privileged to be in conversation with one of my personal heroes. You see, biblical criticism is a growing phenomenon. It's been around already for a century and a half, if not two, but it is growing in terms of its ability to tease apart some of the things that we hold sacred in the Bible. A lot of people are engaging with that critique, but very few are able to counter that criticism. Tonight, we're joined by Rabbi Dr. Josh Berman, who is a professor of Tanakh at Bar-Ilan University. He is a graduate of Princeton University, and he received his smicha from the Rabbanut HaRashit after learning for 8 years at Yeshivat Har Etzion. Rabbi Dr. Berman served as a member of the International Advisory Board for the Museum of the Bible in Washington, D.C. Rabbi Dr. Berman's latest book is a monumental work, Ani Maamin, Biblical Criticism, Historical Truth, and the 13 Principles of Faith. At HGSS, we have a special connection to the book dedicated to Michael and Hilda Aronson. If you open up the front of the book, you will see our beloved members, the Aronsons, are the ones to whom the book is dedicated. Thank you, Michael and Hilda, for everything you do here in the community, and as we now see, really across the globe, defending the faith, standing up for Torah ideals. We're truly very blessed to have you as friends and members of this community. So, without further ado, I bring you Rabbi Dr. Joshua Berman.
Good evening, Rabbi Friedman. Good evening, friends in the UK.
Good evening, Rabbi Dr. Berman. What an honor and privilege to have you here. We had you here for a visit as scholar in residence February last year, and it was so inspiring. My life was forever changed. The way that I look at Torah, the way that I now feel comfortable and confident, knowing that there are answers to some of the difficult, complex challenges, and that somebody of your stature, as both a rabbi and a professor of Bible, who is willing to stand up to others in the field and say, you know what, there are answers. We just need to be able to approach it and look at it from a broad spectrum.
Yeah, I have to say that I'm not alone in this. I might be one of the only Orthodox rabbis who is a Bible professor, but I have lots of kindred spirits, believing Christians who face many of the same issues. And for Christians, this has been a long endeavor. Unlike we Jews, who are kind of new to the academy, relatively speaking, is certainly new to biblical studies. Believing Christians have been kind of grappling with this stuff for a long time, and I've gotten great chizuk, great support from them, and seeing how they work, especially scholars in the UK, I might add. Yeah.
Oh, interesting, but well, thank you for being the one to take the reins as an Orthodox rabbi. It's important because we know that our youth are reading the Bible critically, and it's important that they do have role models, and you are a role model to so many, myself included. Tell me, I know you're not the first Orthodox rabbi to engage in this. I mean, if we go back a couple of generations, there was Rabbi Dr. Umberto Kasuto, who wrote a monumental multi-volume work as professor at Hebrew University of Torah counter-criticism. Can you fill us in on the background? What's happened between Umberto Kasuto and Joshua Berman?
Right. Okay. Well, you can go even further back, because about 100 years ago, maybe the greatest halachic decisor, the greatest posek in Germany 100 years ago was Rav David Tzvi Hoffman. And he too was, totally at home with all of the critical work on the Bible that was being done in German at the time, as was the entire Hildesheimer circle. They were very engaged in this type of endeavor. Kasuto is really a trailblazer for me, because what he did, and he was an Orthodox rabbi, but in his scholarship, he was one of the first to really notice that there's a tremendous amount of beautiful light that can be shed on our Torah the more that we engage ancient Near Eastern texts and understand that world. And we're not just talking about, how they dressed or what they ate, but the whole conceptual world that becomes much clearer when we have these ancient texts. And not only the conceptual world, but how things are written, things that might look to modern eyes like that they are contradictory laws, contradictory accounts. And Kasuto was one of the first to say, when we look at how people thought and how they wrote way back when, then we see where in cases where we know things were written by a single author, you find these very same types of seeming contradictions or repetitions were commonplace and often used as literary devices. So he was kind of a forefather for me. He passed away, Kasuto passed away in 1951. And there's been a lot of scholarly, water under the bridge and many new discoveries. And I will say, humbly, much of it has now been translated into English so that I don't have to, be the specialist in ancient Egyptian and Akkadian and Ugaritic that he had to be. These things are now in English, and much of the work can be done by anybody with translation, and much more discussion and refinement. Just like any area of scholarship. 70 years later, much has happened.
That's really incredible. So Rabbi Kasuto began with examining the Torah within the framework of Near Eastern thought and literature, and you've continued that. Now, if we view the Torah as nitzchit, as an eternal guide or document, how do we fit that with the ability to say, well, we don't understand it in terms of today's literature. We can only understand it in terms of ancient literature.
Right. So that's a pressing question, and I would say that this is an approach to the text that is very well rooted in our sources, and maybe the greatest promulgator of this idea, this way of reading the Torah, of insisting that you must know its ancient context, was none other than the Rambam, Maimonides himself, who uses this way of thinking over and over in Guide to the Perplexed when he explains the rationale for many of the mitzvot, especially aspects of cultic worship in the tabernacle, in the Mishkan, and in the temple, the Bet Mikdash. And many, many times he will say, the way that I understood the significance, the symbolism, the meaning of this or that rite in the temple is because I had access to books, or he thought he had access to books, that were accurate portrayals of ancient Near Eastern worship. And he would say, the Rambam typically will say, what we see that the Torah does is that it takes an ancient practice and it tweaks it. It elevates it one notch to bring it one notch away from the kind of idolatrous worship that the Israelites had been accustomed to in Egypt, and raises it towards something that's more monotheistic or pure in some way. And he does this over and over. Maimonides says at the end of the Guide to the Perplexed, I wish I had found more texts about the ancient world, because then I would have understood more about our mitzvot. And we have another very interesting statement by another major medieval figure, the Ralbag of Levi ben Gershon, known as Gersonides, who wrote a monumental commentary on the Tanakh. And he writes at the end of the book of Exodus, he says the following. He says, this is a famous question that we know that at the end of Exodus, there's a lot of repetition. God tells Moses and Salel, do exactly this, and this in the tabernacle, and then 2 parshiot later it says, and Bezalel did exactly all the same things, and it lists everything all over again. And it seems very repetitious. And Gersonides says, Dalbag says, this bothers me. This bothers me not just as a question, but it's a theological problem, because the Torah is meant to be perfect, and repetition is not perfect. It's like when your first form English teacher will give you back a paper and says, this is too repetitious, tighten it up. Well, the Ralbag's English teacher also, or his French teacher, also did the same thing. And so he's bothered. Why does the Torah seem to write so poorly? And he says, it must be that this is the way in which ancients wrote. and Yidaber Haminhag, Yidaber Hanavi, Lefi Haminhag. The prophet, meaning Moshe here, will write and speak in accordance to the conventions of the time. He wrote that. They were not bothered by this. They were not bothered by it. And the reason that this doesn't in any way impinge or impugn upon the eternal nature of the Torah is that expression, by definition, changes all the time. Americans speak and write a little differently than British people do, and British people today speak a little bit differently than they did 50 years ago and 100 years ago, let alone Jews the world over. It is not possible for the Almighty to somehow express himself in some type of divine Esperanto, where somehow he communicates and everyone understands perfectly. That's not because of a limitation on God. This is the limited nature of man. We are all situated in place and time. And so the eternal nature of the Torah comes out in the way in which it's explained. It has certain guiding principles that are eternal. It gives indices of where it wants us to go. But there's no question that much of it, its precise wording and the way it expresses ideas, there will be some aspects of our Torah which are hidden from us and which only the ancients could understand. And now today we have the blessing, because we have access to these other materials, to now uncover some of these, what were heretofore hidden meanings.
That's really incredible. And I think even within those couple of examples you gave from Maimonides and Gersonides, even within those concepts, we have something that has an eternal message. I mean, to take it up, as Maimonides says, up one notch, kind of tells us that we're not going to be able to transform spiritually as human beings by changing from one end of the one extreme to another extreme one day to the next. And that itself is a message, or the Gersonides message, where they're doing it in the form of what makes sense, how people understand. We have to be able to convey a message of Torah in today's terms, if that means a certain literary device, then that's how we need to do it. That's the message in of itself. I think that's very powerful. Thank you.
Yeah, I would even say that Gersonides, I wish that some of my scholarly colleagues had the approach that Gersonides had, because what Gersonides basically said was, this doesn't look right to me. This looks bad. It's just bad. And he had the humility to say, maybe once upon a time things were different, rather than saying, I must have the answer, this is bad.
Right. I also, you think about sometimes when people approach biblical criticism and they talk about editors and redactors, and it almost feels as if they're being patronizing to the editor or redactor to think that they didn't catch that there was repetition there.
Sometimes that's one of the, right.
So, I mean, tell me, how do you think, if Maimonides were here living in this generation today, I mean, obviously, even back in his time, he was a colorful character. How would he be perceived? Where would he be investing his efforts, do you think?
Oh, my goodness. No, that's too big for me. I don't know. I'm always wary of arguments of the form, if the great Rabbi so-and-so were alive today, I know what he would be doing. So I try to shy away from that. I have enough trouble just trying to figure out what I'm supposed to be doing. So I'm going to pass on that one, Rabbi. Okay.
So let's bring it down to your incredible work. Before we get into, I mean, I'd like to look at some more global issues, but I want to make it real for people. So can you give us some of the examples of things that you found by the revelations of new archaeological and various finds, that now you would understand things differently to the way Maimonides did, in a more revealed way, or even more revealed than Umberto Kasuto was able to see?
Right. So some of the material in the book are my own findings. What I want to share with you and with our viewers tonight is something that I've learned from other scholars. And I'd like to take a term that we're all familiar with. Everybody listening or watching us this evening is familiar with what we say on Seder night when we're sitting at the Seder table and we read the passages that the Almighty took us out of Egypt with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm, which is a phrase that appears in several verses throughout the Torah. And just what does that mean, a mighty hand and an outstretched arm? Well, you might think, that God has strength. That's certainly how I and probably all good Jews understood it for many, many centuries. But about 30 years ago, a colleague of mine named Jim Hoffmeyer noticed the following. He said, if you look in the Egyptian inscriptions from what's called the New Kingdom, which is about 1500 to 1200 BCE, which would roughly correspond to the period of the servitude of the Israelites in Egypt. He says, when you look at the inscriptions of the pharaohs, you see that everything that the pharaoh does is described as having been achieved with his mighty hand and outstretched arm. He expanded the borders, he defeated the Libyans, he went hunting and bagged 120 elephants, all these things with his mighty hand and his outstretched arm. And this is really prevalent in that period. Now, isn't that strange that we find this very phrase used in the Torah? And not only do we find it used in the Torah, but almost exclusively with reference to the Exodus. In other words, if we didn't have any Egyptian texts to look towards as controls for this, we might have asked ourselves, why is it that in the Tanakh, this phrase that Hashem does things with his Yad Chazakah, Uzroa Netuyah, his mighty hand and his outstretched arm, that should describe almost every act of salvation or every miracle that God does, but it doesn't work out that way. It's really only with regard to the Exodus. And what Hoffmeyer says is that what's happening here is what we call cultural appropriation. It's where the oppressed take the propaganda, the symbols of their oppressors, and use them for themselves as a kind of cultural resistance. And this is the way in which the Torah was trying to concretize and make palpable for Bnei Israel at the time, what is this divine being that they can't see and they can't hear? And the answer is, well, he out-pharaohs the pharaoh. He's got a mightier hand and a more outstretched arm than that guy who always talks about his mighty hand and outstretched arm. And I think that's really, really beautiful. And you wouldn't know that without seeing these Egyptian inscriptions. In fact, we can extend this idea of cultural appropriation a little bit more. I have some graphic material that I shared with our technical assistant. Should we bring that up, Rabbi? Stuff about the Mishkan? All right, good. Edward, can you bring up that first slide? All right, I hope you can all see this. What do we have here? This is an ancient Egyptian bas relief. And I'll tell you what it's depicting. The greatest pharaoh of all time was Ramses the Great, Ramses II. And his greatest achievement was something called the Battle of Kadesh. Scholars think it was the largest chariot battle ever in all of history. And that's why you can see here all these chariots here, all these chariots here. Now, amidst this whole thing that looks like one big mess, what we really have is a depiction of Ramses' throne tent and his encampment at the base there at Kadesh. I want everyone to notice some things about this. Ramses' throne tent is, oh, you probably can't see it. I see. Let me see. You can see that there is kind of in the middle of the image. There's a kind of a frame that makes a big rectangle that goes around, a long rectangle. Okay, you can see there's a frame. And you can see kind of in the middle of the frame, there's a littler box, that little box, okay? Now, that is Ramses' throne tent. Can we see the next slide, please? Okay, this is that throne tent blown up. Now, look carefully here. You can see that we have two large chambers here in his throne tent. And when you do the measurements, you see that the larger chamber to the left has proportions of 2 to 1. That is the width is twice the height, okay? And on the right, if you leave out the dome and you were to see the measurements there, you would see that they are proportion 1 to 1, okay? Now, let's go to the next slide. All of this is important because what scholars noted already in the 1930s was the following, that everything that we have just seen on that bas relief of Ramses' camp and Ramses' throne tent at the Battle of Kadesh have exactly the same proportions as what the Torah reports about the tabernacle, the Mishkan, in the book of Exodus. That is, you have in both kind of a perimeter fence that goes all the way around. You have the egress, the entrance into the compound is from the east, okay? Egyptian maps are backwards. East is on the left and west is on the right. I don't know what's behind that, but just take my word for it. So the entrance is in the east, and then in both, in the center of this bordered encampment is a throne tent. So in Ramses' throne tent, so you have, as we saw, two chambers. There's two chambers. There's an outer chamber and an inner chamber. And in the Mishkan, you have the outer chamber, what we call the Kodesh, and the inner chamber, the Kodesh Kodeshim. Okay. Now, and both of these are military encampments. That is, obviously, Ramses' throne tent is in a military encampment, as we saw. And the Torah describes that the Mishkan is surrounded by the tribes of Israel as they encamp in a military encampment as they make their way through the desert. If we could just go back one slide, Edward. Terrific. Here we have again Ramses' throne tent. Now look what's happening in the smaller chamber. Okay, you see these winged figures. Okay, these are falcons. They are emblematic of the god Horus. And in the middle, it's kind of like, I don't know, little dots and lines. That's a cartouche. It's like a little scarab that says on it Ramses. They didn't want to draw Ramses that small, so they just wrote his name. But look what we have here. You have the most important figure, Ramses, in the middle, and these winged figures on either side. Just like we have in Mishkan, you have the Luchot Brit, which are in the Ark of the Covenant, being shielded by winged figures. Obviously not Horus falcons, but by the Kruvim. This is a kind of a ubiquitous motif in the ancient Near East of images that spread their protective wings. So if we could just go back now to the final slide again. Yeah, okay. So this similarity between the tabernacle, the Mishkan, and Ramses' throne tent, what scholars noted, in addition to the things I've said, is the following: that when you look at kind of cultic sites, temples, cultic tents throughout the ancient Near East, you never find anything that looks like the Mishkan. And when you see throne tents in encampments, in bas reliefs from elsewhere in the ancient Near East, you never see anything that looks like Ramses' throne tent. So that it seems to be that the Mishkan might be patterned after, at least in its basic design, the throne tent of Ramses II. And why might that be? Well, scholars already in the 30s they surmised what I said before, that what the Torah is doing is cultural appropriation. It's saying, we have defeated the greatest of all the Egyptian pharaohs, Ramses the Great, Ramses II. And who was he defeated by? Well, he was defeated by the King of Kings, the Almighty. And so the way in which this is concretized for ancient Israelites is that the Mishkan, the tabernacle, is built as kind of on the model of what they had seen at these monumental sites throughout Egypt, the throne tent of Ramses II, the Battle of Kadesh. So this is another example of this cultural appropriation writ large. Okay, we can go back to the live shots of, there we are. Good. Yeah.
Oh, that's incredible.
And it goes on and on and on and on. It's truly remarkable when you see all of it. And I tried to bring many examples of these types of things throughout the book. Mm-hmm.
And I think in terms of if you were a magician, I would ask you, has nobody seen between when you put that rabbit in the hat and when you pulled it out? Nobody's seen. I mean, there was a period of history we didn't know about those base inscriptions. We didn't know. There was no way that somebody could speak to that a little. I mean, if we think that it was appropriated later in history, how might that not be possible?
Right. Okay. So once this is a classic question that comes up in our scholarship when we do this type of work. Okay, fine. You've noticed, or you've claiming that there are two entities, in this case, Ramses' throne tent, the tabernacle, that have a remarkable similarity. Let's say that the Israelites borrowed from the Egyptians. How do we know when that happened? Who knows? It could have been. Maybe it was at that time when tradition tells us there was an exodus, but maybe it happened later on. If you don't have faith, what's to keep anyone from saying that it was borrowed 100 years later, 500 years later, or whenever? And so in this, that's generally an appropriate question from a scholarly perspective. And my scholarly answer to that is the following: that these reliefs, these particular inscriptions, never appear outside of the land of Egypt. They did not migrate. In fact, there are no monumental inscriptions from Egypt that ever made their way outside of Egypt. You'll have little one-line inscriptions, which we have in Eretz Canaan, in the land of Israel, but never major inscriptions. And so whoever wrote the Torah, again, leaving our kippah out of it, okay? Whoever wrote the Torah was in Egypt and had seen these. And I will say more than that. There are some compositions in the ancient world which get passed down through the ages. Forget about the Torah for a second. The Code of Hammurabi, which many of us have heard of. This was copied and learned for 1,500 years. There's something called the Gilgamesh epic, and this was also transmitted over 1,000 years or more. But these inscriptions about Ramses' victory over the Hittites at the Battle of Kadesh were only referenced in his lifetime. They were never copied thereafter. They were never mimicked thereafter. So to say that some Israelite in a cave in the land of Israel 500, 800 years later somehow got hold of this is improbable. And then finally, I will say this, okay? Whenever someone is writing a composition and they include an allusion to another work, okay? They always will do so only if the audience is aware of what they're doing. So that if I were to say here on our broadcast tonight, it was like the bombs bursting in air, I suspect that many of our viewers and listeners don't quite know what I just said. Where's that from? All of our American listeners and viewers would know because it's from the national anthem, the American national anthem. It would make no sense for me in a British setting to cite a line from the American national anthem. And if I did so, I would fail in terms of communicating anything. So to say that some later Israelite writer somehow got hold of these inscriptions when no one in Egypt anymore was paying attention to them and somehow worked it into the Torah to achieve what? No one would know what it's even referring to. And so this is why it seems that these ideas were transmitted roughly at that time.
Wow, incredible. So, and I know that along the lines of what happened in Egypt and the mighty hand and outstretched arm and the Battle of Kadesh, Rabbi Dr. Berman, you really expand on that in terms of the song at the Red Sea. And I encourage our viewers to purchase the book, read really fascinating things that can't be coincidental because these things weren't reported anymore, like you say, for centuries, if not longer. And so the case that you make is just so amazing. And I think that one of your you spoke when you were here at the shul about one of your times that you really felt a little triumphant was to walk out of a conference and to have one of your colleagues say that was pretty good evidence like I've never seen before. So you really make an excellent case, and I do encourage our viewers to buy the book, which I'll add. I know Edward's been flashing on the screen. Tonight we're also being hosted by Koren Magid Books, who your publisher. And so thank you to Koren, to Magid for publishing such a monumental work. Let's move to a general question now. I know you addressed the issue of history, and history being a concept that is relatively new. The way we understand history was not the way the ancients understood history, and the way we look at the Torah, some of us, perhaps as a history book, is not perhaps what the Torah was meant to be designed as. So what is history? How do we view it? How did the ancients view it? And what is the Torah, or what isn't the Torah?
Oh my! So this I do address this in the book. It's a kind of a lengthy topic to get straight. Okay, I'm not quite sure if I'm not certain I can really do it justice in the short time that we have. But I will say this, that pre-modern writers, including Herodotus, including the Venerable Bede, individuals who are considered to be historians, were not doing precisely what historians are meant to do today. That is, we assume whenever we pick up a book, a reputable book of history, a history of Churchill or of World War II, then our foundational assumption is that we know that no historian can ever get everything right, and he or she are always going to be selective in what they present to us as readers. But we do assume this, that everything that a responsible historian will include in his or her history book is actual fact, no embellishment, and no call to the reader to therefore believe this, that, or the other. Just present facts and let the reader conclude for his or herself. This was not the case with the quote-unquote history writing of figures like Herodotus or Thucydides or the Venerable Bede. All of these men were taking traditions about what they had heard, which they assumed to be true, and they all believed that they had license to embellish those stories. Because what was always assumed until not so long ago, about 200 years ago, is that when someone speaks of the past, that person will be a person of authority who is trying to teach a lesson. And because what's so important is to teach the lesson, they will use events that they truly believed happened, and they will have no qualms about adding little embellishments to the story to make sure the message gets through to the hearts of the listeners. And I believe that this is true of our Torah and our Tanakh. Rav Kook writes this explicitly. He says, every story in the Torah is meant to leave an imprint on the soul of the Jewish reader. Rav Kook says, when the Torah felt, when HaKadosh Baruch Hu felt, that just presenting the facts as they actually happened, that by itself would leave the imprint on the soul of the person reading the Torah, then it gave just the facts. And when HaKadosh Baruch Hu felt that, maybe the facts themselves wouldn't give the full import, you wouldn't get it if you just had the bare facts, then the Torah will not hesitate to include some embellishment of what went on in order that we're able to learn the proper lesson about really what that event was all about and why it's so important and what its message is. And I think that this is absolutely true. And I think that we do ourselves a disservice when we say, I am a believing Jew, and therefore I must believe that every jot and tittle that's written inside our Torah was factual 100%. This is a modern mishigas, because we live in an age where people assume either it is fully factual or it is fake news. And that's just not a dichotomy that is true. It's not. Maybe that works for us today as moderns. We don't want anyone to tell us what to think. Just tell me the facts. We want the Independent or the Guardian. Just tell me the facts. Don't editorialize. I will read about what the Prime Minister said or what Trump said, and I will make the judgment. But Torah is coming from a different angle. The Almighty wants to make the judgment. He wants to tell you what these events were about. And so he will shape them to some degree without any qualms. And it doesn't, and believing that is in no way detracts from our belief in the divinity or the veracity of what the Torah is saying.
And I think you demonstrate in your book multiple occasions that On the contrary, not only is it not detracting, it assists us. Sometimes when we read things in the Torah that we think are irrelevant details, like the numbers of the census in the wilderness, and how you relate one number to another, and the fact that they're rounded, you demonstrate that there's meaning. There's meaning for us today. They're not just descriptions of something that happened.
Right.
Once we understand these principles that you've laid out for us, so thank you, Ashikoah, for that.
Mm-hmm.
Tell me, we here, we grew up in the UK, and myself in Australia, same thing, on the Hertz Pentateuch. And in that Chumash, Chief Rabbi Hertz sought to incorporate insights from scholarship with traditional rabbinic sources. In the last 70 years or so, most Orthodox rabbis have shied away entirely from the issue of academic biblical studies and the questions raised by biblical criticism. I'm going to shift the question here. What happened? Why are we so scared? Why was Chief Rabbi Hertz prepared to incorporate, and I would say Abarbanel and others were prepared to incorporate ideas that nowadays we wouldn't go near?
Gosh, I don't really know, what the zeitgeist was like, in Rabbi Hertz's time. When you're speaking to a culture that's very engaged, when you're speaking to a Jewish culture that is very engaged with the world around it, there is a need for this type of work. And so I mentioned before Rav David Tzvi Hoffman, also Sri Eish, Rabbi Weinberg, also from that circle. German Jews prior to the war were very engaged with German culture. Hirsch is also the same. And so these figures felt the need, because Jews were exposed to these critical views from the academy, someone would have to step up and try to make sense of how this fits with what the Masorah, our tradition, has taught us about these texts and about these events. I think that perhaps in the post-war period, perhaps Jews, although they were, reestablishing lives across the globe and achieving success and wealth that was unprecedented, I think the engagement of traditional Jews with the wider culture was perhaps not what it was in pre-war Germany. And what's changed now is that you don't have to go out and engage biblical criticism. It washes into your office and your living room every time you open your screen. Now, not every time, but the point is, it used to be that if you wanted to know about something about biblical criticism, you had to go to a library, you had to know the name of the books, you had to take time. And here, it's just ubiquitous. You open up, you do this, and it's there. And so everybody is exposed to it, everybody. There are no walls anymore. There are no walls. I have had this book read by a large circle of Satmar Hasidim in Williamsburg. Yes. And they called me and we did a Zoom meeting of like 7 of them. And we sat and they asked me questions. Yes. The highest walls can't keep it out anymore.
Wow. Now, of course, we have a legacy here in this country as well of Rabbi Louis Jacobs. And so I guess the question is it dangerous if my child is reading biblical criticism? Should I be worried, or should I direct them and guide them?
It's like everything else, Rabbi Friedman, in my humble opinion. It is not possible anymore to tell your child, to limit your child in any way. You cannot do it in terms of what they're going to be exposed to. You can put up some filters on various computers. I have yet to find a filter that keeps out biblical criticism. Okay. In terms of the world of ideas, it is all out there, and our children are not only liable, they will be exposed to everything. I see that the readers of my book tend to be, you can almost put it on a graph. People in their 50s, some, people in their 40s, more, people in their 30s, even more, people in their 20s, even more. And it's all a function of how early in their lives did they get hooked into everything that's going on the internet. And so we have no choice but to address these issues, as I see it.
Just before I ask my next question, I just want to let our viewers know that we do encourage in the comments section, if you have questions for Rabbi Dr. Berman, please do. This is a live
Oh,
conversation.
right.
Please
Oh,
do
lovely.
post your comments, and I will
Okay.
address them to Rabbi Dr. Berman.
I think I see them as well, yes.
Yeah, so Rabbi Dr. Berman, let me ask you. I mean, you're Rabbi Dr. Berman. So first Rabbi, then Doctor.
Yes.
Social science 101 is the facts don't speak for themselves. And you come to the table with a certain prism. And you are known as the #1 Orthodox rabbi, countercritic, biblical countercritic. How do you ensure, or maybe it's not possible for anybody to ensure, that you're not bringing your own agenda, your own bias to the table?
Right. All scholars come to the table with who they are. Okay. I will say this: that when I write essays, articles, books, they are vetted by scholars who are not Orthodox rabbis. They're not Orthodox Jews. They're usually not even Jews. And when I submit an article to a journal, my name doesn't even appear on it. So they do not know my name, or that it's written by a rabbi or someone wearing tzitzit or anything. And so all that's left are the arguments and the evidence, and that's what they judge. So it could well be that I have been driven to write an article by a certain interest, but all scholars are written by a certain interest. And the question becomes, what makes the scholarship legitimate is that it is deemed to be worthy by people who do not share my own faith commitments. In the academy today, if you have a feminist writer, or writers who come, or some of whom are disabled, handicapped, and they come from an orientation of disability studies, their own orientations I have learned tremendous amounts from. Okay, and I think that every scholar has where they come from, and or perhaps unique perspectives. The question is, can you express it using the evidence and the arguments that we all share to show that this reading is bona fide, even if you don't come from that specific background? And I will say that I believe that being an Orthodox Jew actually makes me a better scholar. And the reason for that is that sometimes, perhaps because I have an interest in identifying how the Torah, let's say, holds together, that has more integrity and is less riven with contradictions and inconsistencies, that I seek out ways of demonstrating through parallel literature in the ancient world that this stuff was going on beforehand. And I will say that the parts of my scholarship that have gotten the greatest accolades are often the things that I know in my heart I went to look into because I am an Orthodox Jew. And people say, wow, Berman has turned over stones that we never thought to turn over. And he's seen things under those stones that we never noticed before when we looked.
Right.
And so I don't see the problem. I think it contributes. Sure, there are challenges from there. We have to think. Sometimes it requires a little bit of theological flexibility. We haven't spoken about the second half of the book, but that as well. Very long exploration of what is the role of the principles of faith, the ikarei ha'emunah. What does it mean that we have accepted ikarei emunah? What has that acceptance meant at different points in our history? It's very important to know that, and it's changing all the time. What the Chafetz Chaim felt about the principles is not the same as what Rav Moshe Feinstein felt about them. And so I think that it's important precisely for those of us that are traditional, that accept the principles of faith, to understand the history of what that acceptance has meant. And this I go into at length in the second half of the book.
Right. Okay. So let me just take the question and flip it the other way. Do you, I asked about what you bring to the table as an Orthodox rabbi. Does that bias? Do you find the other way that on account of the ideas that you're expressing, the positions that you're defending, I'm to put it succinctly, do you get hate mail? Do you get universities that won't host you because you are they don't want to hear what you have to say?
Well, they might be out there, but I probably don't appeal to them to invite me. So I will say I was very disappointed. Some of this material about similarities between parts of the book of Exodus and these inscriptions by Ramses II. I wrote an article, I submitted it to a journal, and the editor said to me, it looks like it's agenda driven, so I can't even accept it. I can't even accept to look at it. I was very disappointed. Why don't you take my name off and just, let's just try to use the rules that we have of how do we look at things that seem parallel? Does it seem to hold up to that level or not? And I think that there's probably no issue in the scholarship of the Hebrew Bible that is more charged politically than was there in Exodus. As I've noted in a few places, unfortunately, you'll find scholars on both sides of this question. And when you're speaking of American scholars, overwhelmingly, the scholars that believe there never was an Exodus vote one way for U.S. presidential elections, and the scholars that believe that there was an Exodus tend to vote the other way. It shouldn't be that way. I'm not saying here who's right, but that shows you that people come with who they are.
Right.
Yeah.
So you started speaking to this, and maybe it's the second half of your book, but Moshe Isaacson has asked, and he says, given that Maimonides' principles of faith have become to many in the Orthodox community the de facto definition of required Jewish beliefs, yet based on your writings, we may have reason to question the validity of one or more of those principles. How can an Orthodox person resolve the tension between current scholarship and quote unquote necessary beliefs?
Oh, let me just look at this. I wouldn't necessarily say that. Can we just put that quote back up so I can see what it was? Based on your writings, we may have reason to question the validity of one or more of those principles. Now, I wouldn't agree with that statement. I don't think that reflects my view. What I do believe is this, that even though you will find over the last 1,000 years, since Maimonides, let's say, what appears to be a wide divergence of opinions within great rabbinical writings about the concept of principles of faith generally, and dispute about particular ones. In my humble opinion, there truly is no debate at all. There's no debate at all. How could that be? Because I believe, and I try to demonstrate this by going through the sources in the book, is that what truly guided and continues to guide all rabbinic figures on the issue of principles of belief, what guides all of them is really one goal. They all shared the same goal, which is, given where I am living, what's going on around me at this time, in this place, what is the position that I, as a rabbinic authority, need to take to ensure the one thing that was ever of importance to rabbinic authorities? What do I need to say to ensure that my audience will be led to greater piety, yirat shamayim, and to greater observance of the mitzvot, kiyum mitzvot? In some periods and in some places, that meant totally ripping up the idea of principles of faith. When we have examples throughout history where Jews are saying, well, the Christians just believe, and that's good enough for them, so tell us what our beliefs are, and that'll be good enough for us, which has happened a few times. You can see great figures across history have said, forget about those principles of faith. Put tefillin on. How about that? That's a principle of faith. Okay. As recently as Rav Shimshon Raphael Hirsch. Okay. Hirsch believed that all the things that we call principles of faith were true, but he doesn't believe. He says he doesn't think that there should be any things that are elevated to be principles of faith, because he had German Jews who were saying, just tell us what to believe. That's all that's important. And you can see that Rav Moshe Feinstein and the Chafetz Chaim addressed issues, the standing and the status of the principles in different ways. So that's the claim that I make, that at every age and every stage, the great minds of Israel, of the great leaders of Israel, have always had their eye on the ball. What needs to be said now, here, today, to give my audience, which is always changing, a greater sense of piety and a greater commitment to Torah and mitzvot.
Wow, it's very powerful, and I think as well, in some sense, very liberating. It always comes down to the question in the Gemara as to what were those fundamental ideas. You know, this prophet took it down to so many approaches that you needed, and then no, it was only two. There was only one, and I think you've really summed it up. So that's really something that will stay with me. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Rabbi Dr. Berman, for joining us this evening. The book is Ani Maamin, Biblical Criticism, Historical Truth, and the 13 Principles of Faith, published by Magid Books under Koren. I urge our viewers, our congregation, and those watching us around the world to purchase the book. Rabbi Dr. Berman, leading figure, hero of our generation. Thank you so much, Rabbi Dr. Berman. It's been a privilege to chat with you this evening.
Okay, yeah, just let me also add that I believe, it's coming on here. I'm going to be on Mizrahi, UK on the 7th of July, speaking about how the Torah broke with ancient political thought. It is remarkable how ahead of its time the Torah was on a whole range of issues that come up only thousands of years later in political thought. So we'll see you then. Thank you so much, Rabbi Friedman.
Don't go anywhere for one moment. I'm going to just introduce Dan Rickman, a beloved member of our congregation. Dan has an important book club as part of our congregation, and as it happens, the book that they are featuring this month is Ani Maamin. And Dan, please join us and just tell us a little about the book club.
Okay, hi, thank you very much, and thank you for that fascinating discussion and introduction to our next book, indeed. So we've been running the book club. I'm Dan Rickman. We've been running a Jewish Studies book club for about 10 years now. I was surprised to discover. And we've covered a whole range of issues: philosophy, halakha, history, Zionism. As the Rabbi mentioned, Ani Maamin is our next book. So that was a great intro for this. Rabbi Berman, Dr. Berman, has very kindly offered to invite to join us if he's free. Which would be an absolute privilege. The meeting's going to be not quite this month; it's September. We meet about 2 or 3 times a year just to give people a chance to read the books. So it's actually September the 9th. It would be great if anybody who's been inspired by the talk tonight would like to come and join us and get more involved with the book club. We're always looking for new members and also, suggestions for further books. It's a wide range of if you like, academic works on Judaism, which are available, accessible to the wider Jewish public, and which are really fascinating to read. So we're looking forward very much to that evening and discussing Ani Maamin, especially after this talk. And thanks for the chance to mention the book club. If you want to know more, just get in touch with me either via the office, or those of you who know who I am can find me.
Thank you so much, Dan. And once again, thank you, Rabbi Dr. Berman. Thank you, Edward, for so seamlessly putting this evening's event together. And looking forward, hopefully very soon, when all of this craziness ends, to seeing you back here in the shul. Rabbi Dr. Berman, you are always so welcome in our congregation.
Okay. All right. Good.
Have a good night.